In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union grappled with systemic economic decay, its citizens often endured hours-long queues for basic necessities. By 1989, residents of cities like Moscow and Leningrad, despite living in a nation rich in natural resources, faced empty shelves and dwindling supplies, a stark consequence of decades of military-first policies under leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev, who inherited a system prioritizing defense over civilian welfare. This internal rot, visible in the daily struggles of ordinary people, foreshadowed the dramatic shifts that would soon reshape the global order. Tonight, similar concerns are mounting as reports confirm multiple fuel depots have been struck. These images, coming to us from Tehran, the capital of one of the world's largest oil producers, show a nation that produces millions of barrels of oil each day. Yet its own citizens are now enduring hours-long queues simply to acquire 20 liters of gasoline. Schools are empty, workplaces deserted, shop owners are shuttering their businesses. And on the streets, a stark contrast. Vehicles belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, are seen moving freely through priority lanes, while civilian cars remain stranded, their tanks empty. Tehran residents are expressing widespread anger and exhaustion, caught in these endless queues for gasoline. A profound fuel crisis unfolding in an oil-rich nation. This is not merely a logistical issue. This is the unfolding story of a regime that has fed its military by sacrificing its own people, and in the process has rotted from within. President Pezeshkian went on national television to admit the country's energy crisis and asked his citizens to accept living in darkness to reduce their consumption of electricity and energy. He stated, "Right now, we don't need the sacrifices of these loved ones, but we need to control consumption. What's wrong with turning on 2 lights at home instead of 10? To understand the roots of this crisis, we must go back to the end of February, the first days of the war. During the conflict that began on February 28th, U.S. and Israeli airstrikes directly targeted Iran's energy infrastructure. Refineries were struck, oil storage facilities were set ablaze, and distribution centers sustained significant damage. In particular, Israel's direct strikes on fuel storage facilities linked to the IRGC in and around Tehran, such as Sharon and similar sites, on March 7th, sent shockwaves through the capital. The fires raged for days, and the storage facilities became inoperable. The result was extremely severe. Iran's refining capacity dropped by approximately 50%. The daily gasoline shortage reached 20 million liters, and the government immediately reduced the quota on civilian fuel cards from 30 liters to 20 liters. This drastic reduction in refining capacity and immediate cut to civilian quotas is highly unusual, as most nations facing such a critical energy shortfall would first exhaust strategic reserves or implement staggered rationing to mitigate immediate public impact, rather than an abrupt, across-the-board reduction that signals a profound systemic vulnerability. But there is a very critical detail here. The IDF identified the depots struck by Israel as IRGC-owned military fuel distribution centers. In other words, these depots were supplying fuel not to civilians, but to the Revolutionary Guards and their affiliated units. And while the impact of the refinery damage on civilian life hit overnight, the consequences have been building up for months. Over 90% of Iran's domestic trade is transported by road, and these trucks cannot move without diesel. When diesel quotas were reduced due to military priorities, the transportation sector collapsed immediately. On the black market, diesel prices skyrocketed to 8 to 10 times the official price. Freight rates doubled, but buyers cannot afford these prices. The result? Thousands of trucks came to a stop on the roadside. Engines silent, drivers helpless. And a domino effect has begun behind these stranded trucks. The food supply chain was the first link to break. The number of trucks arriving at Tehran's major markets has dropped by half. Vegetable and fruit prices have skyrocketed, and potato prices have risen to 4 times pre-war levels. Medicine distribution is the second link. Insulin and vaccines requiring a cold chain are not reaching pharmacies, and patients with chronic conditions cannot fill their prescriptions. The construction sector is the third domino. Construction sites have stopped, and unskilled workers have lost their daily wages. Grocers, produce vendors, butchers, tens of thousands of small business owners reliant on daily deliveries have closed their shops. Currently in Iran, unemployment has risen by an additional approximately 2 million people since the October 2025 economic crisis. The addition of 2 million unemployed individuals in such a short period, particularly in an economy already reeling from a previous crisis, represents an extraordinary and rapid deterioration of the labor market. This scale of job loss typically occurs over years, not months, highlighting the acute and cascading economic shockwaves now gripping the nation. In an oil-rich country, trucks have come to a standstill, shelves have emptied, and the nation's logistical backbone has been shattered. But the anger of Iranian truck drivers is not new, and the regime knows this all too well. In May 2025, months before the war, Iran's 365,000 truck drivers had launched a nationwide strike. The uprising that began in Bandar Abbas spread to Isfahan, Shiraz, Tehran, and Kermanshah, bringing freight transport to a standstill for 11 days in over 155 cities. Tehran's cargo terminal was completely empty. Drivers were protesting low wages, high insurance premiums, and fuel price hikes, and nurses, teachers, and bakers had shown their support for the truckers. During that strike, the IRGC had tried to transport cargo using its own trucks with armed escorts, but it could not sustain the transport. The regime was forced to suppress the strike by arresting hundreds of drivers. And just 7 months later, in December 2025, a much larger uprising erupted across all 31 provinces of Iran. The economic crisis, hyperinflation, and the collapse of the rial drove millions into the streets. In January 2026, 1.5 million people protested in Tehran alone. It is estimated that 5 million people were in the streets nationwide. The regime's response was brutal. Thousands were killed, and over 50,000 were arrested. Now the same truckers, the same people, the same anger, but this time facing a far deeper crisis created by the war. And this time there is no need for a strike, because the system has collapsed on its own. No fuel, no trips, no income. This is a de facto strike, but not an organized action. It is a country destroying itself. And perhaps the most critical aspect of this crisis is this: who takes priority when fuel runs low? There is no official IRGC specific exemption law. The Iranian regime does not transparently disclose such matters. But what is happening on the ground is crystal clear. When civilian rations were cut, IRGC and military operations continued uninterrupted. Seizures of ships in the Strait of Hormuz, drone activities, and missile alerts continued. While the IRGC's jet fuel and diesel needs were met, civilians waited for hours for just 20 liters of gasoline. The IRGC has its own fuel distribution depots and logistics networks. It holds deep economic control over the oil and refining sectors through holdings like Khatam al-Anbiya. During a crisis, the regime redirects resources to the military under the guise of national security and military needs. Officially, this is called distribution management. But in practice, it is very simple. While the army's tanks are being filled, the citizen's car remains empty. And the public sees this discrimination. Ironic posts on X, like "quotas up, go get a card from the IRGC," are widespread. Claims circulated that an IRGC gas station in Yazd was occupied by the public and fuel was distributed for free. Videos showing IRGC vehicles given priority passage in some neighborhoods have gone viral on social media. Claims that Basij members are receiving unlimited fuel with special cards are being supported by new posts every day. The social impact of this injustice goes far beyond a mere logistical issue. Ordinary citizens may have begun to think that the regime is sacrificing us, especially among the young population. The perception that the military is using fuel for war is fueling anti-military sentiments. The IRGC commander's rhetoric of national resistance has become a subject of ridicule among civilians because resistance carries a very different meaning in the language of a family struggling to survive on 20 liters of gasoline. The issue here is not just fuel, it is legitimacy. When a regime fails to meet its people's daily needs and diverts existing resources to its military apparatus, the social contract between the regime and the people collapses. In Iran, this contract was already fraying. Cheap gasoline and subsidies were among the few tangible benefits the regime offered its people. Now that even that benefit has disappeared, the question, "What are you offering us?" remains. The gas lines in Tehran are no longer just a logistical problem. They have become a barometer of the breaking point of society. But perhaps the most dangerous dynamic is this. Public anger is turning toward the IRGC. Civilians are thinking, while we wait in line, their vehicles are full. Young people are questioning the regime's military-first policy on social media, and some groups are even discussing plans for sabotage against fuel depots. This tension is not new, but war conditions have exacerbated it. Small business owners are closing shop, and this wave of bankruptcies is driving up unemployment. As unemployed youth flood the streets, crime rates are rising, and the black market fuel trade is fueling the shadow economy. A parallel market has emerged outside the regime's control. In this parallel market, the price per liter can reach 10 times the official rate, and this is further deepening social inequality. Israeli military logistics were targeted, but the government offset the loss by reducing civilian quotas. When the military's fuel supply was cut off, it was covered by the public's fuel. The direct result of striking the IRGC fuel depots in Tehran was civilian lines on the streets. Military damage was converted into a civilian cost. And this conversion was a deliberate policy. Under the guise of national security, the regime shifted existing stockpiles to the military, cutting back on civilian distribution. While out-of-gas signs were hanging at gas stations in Tehran's outskirts, IRGC convoys were smoothly continuing their fuel resupply. At the same time, these images directly fueled the perception among the public that fuel is being stolen from us and given to the military. Iran's oil minister stated in late April that there was no cause for concern regarding fuel supply and distribution, and set a target to increase refinery capacity to 70 to 80%. But as of mid-May, this target still appears not to have been fully achieved. Lines continue, panic buying persists, and the public is growing increasingly angry. The oil minister's no cause for concern statement stands in direct contrast to the reality on the streets. And this contradiction is further exacerbating the trust crisis in the regime's communication with the public. And Iran's internal fractures are not limited to the streets. They are deepening within the regime's own structure. While President Pezeshkian seeks a diplomatic solution, the IRGC is making decisions on the ground unilaterally. While Iran's foreign minister states that a military adventure is being preferred, even though a diplomatic solution is on the table, he is actually indirectly pointing to the IRGC. And the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Command announced immediately following the president's statement that he was apologizing to neighbors that U.S. and Israeli bases will remain primary targets. While the president says, "We will not attack," the military's own headquarters states, "We will continue to target." Such a blatant internal contradiction may indicate that the regime's decision-making mechanism has effectively collapsed. Analysts estimate the risk of a civil war sparking at around 30%. This is not a low figure, and if lines continue to grow, quotas continue to drop, and IRGC privileges become more visible, this percentage could rise rapidly. The regime is moving towards suppression through force, but force can always backfire. And here a historical parallel stands out. In November 2019, gasoline price hikes triggered the largest popular uprising in Iranian history. Security forces killed hundreds of protesters. The spark for that uprising was merely a price hike, an increase of just a few cents per liter. Now, however, it is not about a price increase. It is about a direct fuel shortage and unfair distribution. The powder was damp in 2019. Now it is bone dry, and the spark is far more powerful. To fully grasp Iran's fuel crisis, one must examine how the country's domestic production shortfall has combined with the pressure of external sanctions, because these two crises feed into each other. On March 4th, the IRGC effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Through this narrow waterway, which accounts for 20% of global oil trade, traffic decreased by 95%, dropping from 20 million barrels per day to 3 to 4 million barrels per day. The IEA described this as the largest oil supply disruption in history, and the military dimension of this fuel crisis is just as critical as the civilian one. Yes, the IRGC currently has fuel priority. Jet fuel and diesel are being allocated for missile and drone operations, but this priority is not sustainable. As the 50% loss in refinery capacity continues, the balance between military and civilian needs is becoming increasingly fragile. And with every drop less allocated to the civilian side each day, the anger on the streets builds by another drop. Military families are also directly affected by the civilian crisis. While the family of a soldier fighting on the front lines waits in a gas line in Tehran, how high can that soldier's morale remain? When a commander says, "You're fighting for the homeland," the question in the soldier's mind might be, "Well, how will my family get home?" This collapse in morale is not just psychological, it's operational. Commanders are making extra efforts to boost morale, but fuel shortages are even limiting training exercises. And the US-led coalition sees this weakness extremely clearly and is focusing the pressure precisely on this point. The US blockade is causing a loss of $500 million in oil revenue per day. Storage capacity is running out. Tanks on Karg Island are full, but there is no port to export from. And it is estimated that Iran's oil reserves will last between a few weeks and at most 3 months. The confluence of a $500 million daily revenue loss and rapidly depleting export capacity, with reserves estimated to last only weeks, presents an exceptionally dire strategic dilemma. Historically, nations facing such a critical energy chokehold would typically seek immediate diplomatic off-ramps or significant internal austerity measures, a path that appears increasingly constrained for Tehran. The CIA is gathering intelligence on the ground, but exact figures cannot be provided because Iran has never been fully transparent about its own resources. The coalition strategy is crystal clear: to turn Iran's own weapon against itself. The IRGC sought to choke the world by closing the Strait of Hormuz. But with the US blockade and refinery strikes, Iran is choking itself. With each passing day, the fuel behind the IRGC's "we're ready" rhetoric is dwindling, and its military capacity is eroding. But one thing is clear: if the war drags on or new refinery attacks occur, the 60% damage to production could collapse military logistics as well. The IRGC's "we're ready" mantra may hold true for now. But with each passing week, the fuel behind that claim is dwindling. And perhaps the most strategic consequence is this: as Iran's conventional military power is constrained by the fuel crisis, asymmetric tactics are coming to the fore. The IRGC can continue drone and missile operations with limited fuel, but its ground operation capacity is dwindling. Tanks cannot move without fuel, armored convoys cannot advance without diesel, and air defense systems cannot function without spare parts. This shift is changing Iran's defense doctrine out of necessity. As conventional power diminishes, dependence on asymmetric capabilities is increasing. But asymmetric warfare also requires fuel. Runways are needed for drones to take off. Generators are needed to launch missiles, and electricity is needed for command centers to operate. The fuel crisis is threatening every link in this chain. When we look at the bigger picture, Iran's fuel crisis is not just an energy problem. It is an existential test for the regime. Civilians are suffering. The military is weakening. The economy is collapsing, and internal fissures are deepening. And all of this is happening at the same time in a self-perpetuating spiral of collapse. One of the world's largest oil producers cannot even provide its own people with 20 liters of gasoline. Refineries are damaged. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Exports are zero. And the majority of the current limited production is being funneled to the IRGC, leaving civilians with lines, quotas, and anger. Iran's oil minister says there is no cause for concern. But the scenes on the streets of Tehran paint a very different picture. Families cannot sustain their daily lives. Shopkeepers are closing their stalls. Young people are questioning the regime. And the nightmare of the 2019 gasoline uprising is fresh in everyone's mind. Gas lines have become not just a symbol of fuel shortages, but the most visible symbol of a regime rotting from within. With every line, impatience builds. With every quota cut, trust erodes. And with every IRGC privilege, anger grows. And this spiral of collapse feeds on itself. The fuel crisis is crushing the economy. The economic collapse is fueling social anger. Social anger is pushing the regime toward greater repression. Repression is leading to further loss of trust. And that loss of trust is making everything even worse. History shows that revolutions do not arise from major wars. They arise when people's daily lives become unbearable. The French Revolution began in bread lines. The Soviet Union collapsed when store shelves ran empty. And the 2011 Arab Spring ignited when a street vendor set himself on fire. Tehran's gas lines may be approaching exactly that unbearable point, and it appears the regime has neither the fuel nor the water left to put out this fire.